So I'm so excited today to be talking to one of my own personal heroes, Mallory Hagan. She was Miss America 2013 and has always been an incredible advocate for body positivity and self-acceptance. And I'm thrilled that you have taken the time to talk to me today. Thank you so much.
I am excited to be here. It's so good to see you. Glad to see you're doing well.
Good to see you too. Well, if you could just give people some background, like where did you grow up? What is your family like?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in a small town in Alabama called Opelika. It's right next to Auburn University and Auburn, which is a big college town. So I grew up very Friday Night Lights, and when I was 19, I had no job, no nothing, and moved to New York. And I'm sure now that you've lived in New York for all of your years, you understand that was a little crazier than necessary at 19. But yeah, lived in New York for several years, and when I was ready to go back to school, I got involved in the Miss America organization again. I had competed in Alabama, and a couple of years into doing that, I ended up winning Miss America. And post Miss America, I did a couple of things and then came back home where I was a news anchor, and then I ran for office. So I've been all over the place, but it's good to be back in Alabama where I've been for a few years now.
Well, my dad's from Montgomery, so very familiar with Alabama. He's a big Alabama fan, but we won't hold
Oh,
your.
no. Well, he and my dad can get together on that one. Not in War Eagle.
My gosh. So how did you get involved in pageants? Because I know you did the Outstanding Teen program. Why did you want to do that?
Yeah. Well, so I'm actually what I would consider a third generation Miss America participant, fan, volunteer, whatever you want to call it. So my grandmother was involved from a production standpoint. My grandmother owned a dance studio, so she was very involved in Miss Tennessee. And one of her best friends, Tina, ran the Miss Auburn Opelika competition here and also the Miss Lee County Fair competition. It went back and forth between being a local. So people were very involved for a long time. And when I was old enough, Miss Tina said, hey, they're starting a teen competition. It was the very first year it existed in Alabama. There wasn't even a national competition at that time. So I did it. I did the statewide competition. There was like 40 something girls in it, and I got third runner up on my first try. So first year, third runner up. I did it because I had a talent. My mom has owned a dance studio since I was small, and I just kept going back. So third runner up, first runner up, second runner up, you name it, I've been the runner up. So that's when I got started.
Character building.
Determination.
So you moved to New York, like you said, when you were 19, and I can relate. I moved up there when I was 18 from Georgia. So I get that whole culture shock of ending up in New York City after growing up in a Friday Night Lights kind of experience. Mm-hmm. What was that transition like? And can you talk about your decision to start competing there?
Sure. Well, the transition was very difficult. I had less than $1,000. I had been to New York several times for dance, had gone up there and spent, a couple of weeks here, a couple of weeks there. But I just sort of said, do or do not, there is no try. My dad's a huge Star Wars fan. Just did it. I mean, they're like, it's sort of those, you jump off a cliff and you have to figure out how to fly. Yeah. So I went on 22 open calls for jobs in the first 24 hours of being in New York and got a job at Planet Hollywood in Times Square.
Yes.
To eat my staff meal every day, which consisted of a burger and fries most times. And so it was about a year into living there that I started looking around and being like, all right, I should probably figure out what the school situation is going to be, or else I might be like 45 still working at Planet Hollywood, and I don't really want that. So I started looking into programs in New York, and my mom, owning a dance studio at night, also owned a salon during the day. My mom's a cosmetologist, and so she owned two businesses, and I just grew up loving that industry, and I thought I really wanted to go to cosmetology school, but I ended up looking into FIT's cosmetic and fragrance marketing program, which was sort of the best of both worlds, like kind of business, but also in that world that I really loved. And started competing in the Miss New York organization as a way to pay for it. That combined with, I'll never forget, one year I was watching Miss America with my mom via FaceTime. And after it was all over with, she on FaceTime looked at me and said, if that girl just won, you absolutely can too. There's nothing she's doing that you can't do as well. So she sort of put that bug in my ear again, and I competed 2 months later. and then ended up being first runner-up twice to Miss New York before I won. So it was a combination of things, a little bit of, I think I needed some goals in my life at that time. I was 21, and also wanting to go back to school and finding a way to pay for it. So Miss New York paid for the first couple of years before I won Miss America.
Wow. Because you'd been to Auburn for a while, right?
I did. I went to Auburn my freshman year. I did the whole thing. I joined a sorority and went to all the football games and was, a Tiger Splasher, which is the people who clock the swim team. I tried really hard to do the things you're supposed to do as a freshman in college. And I just have never really felt like I fit in here. I've really always marched to my own drum and have always just wanted more. Not to say that what happens in small town life is wrong or bad. It's just not for me. And it definitely wasn't at the time. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate. I mean, going to New York for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a minority, it's the wildest thing. You're walking down the street. No one cares whatsoever what you're doing, what you look like. I've never felt
show tunes in the middle of the street and no one cares.
No one cares. No one's listening. You can be talking to yourself and no one cares. You can just be completely yourself. And I love that about New York.
Nice.
But you said you wanted more, so you got more, and you won Miss America in 2013. So I'm sure you were on this crazy high after winning. And then the Hawaii photo controversy happens.
Yeah, nuts.
So ridiculous. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how what was going through your head and how that kind of shaped your year moving forward?
Yeah. Well, getting ready for Miss America was a long and rigorous process of very restrictive eating and in some ways unhealthy eating habits. Not to mention I had a regular regimented workout that I was doing alongside my trainer. But on top of that, I was also tapping an hour a day every day. So you add in like my normal workout and then I've got an hour of cardio. And then most days I was also, or about every other day for at least 8 weeks leading up to Miss America, I was also going to Bikram yoga. So that's another hour and a half of cardiovascular workout, sweating. I was working out 3+ hours a day for the 8 weeks leading up to Miss America. And I think I was thinking about, it's so funny because when you're in the interview room and you're preparing for the experience itself, I was working really hard on preparing to be Miss America. I was not focusing on the competition. And I think that's where a lot of times people in the organization and in pageantry as a whole, they're not focused on what they're supposed to do once they win. They're just focused on winning, right? And so in many ways, I was very focused on what I was going to do in that role and what I wanted to see the organization do and how I wanted to see it evolve. I wasn't just focused on the stage. But what I hadn't thought through was how will I sustain this absolutely unrealistic version of myself that I've created from a physical perspective. I had grown by leaps and bounds as a human being. I mean, I had thought through every political thing I had ever wanted to think about, right? I had all of these marketing and branding ideas and plans, but I just hadn't thought through when I'm on the road and this isn't something that is being, I don't want to say forced on me, but I'm not gonna, the idea of being in the swimsuit's not there anymore, right? Yeah. Like there's no pressure from that perspective. I just hadn't thought that through. And so I'll start with that like, it's a very rigorous process to get to that point. And then it's like, oh no, what am I going to do while I'm in airports, in hotels, like all of this stuff. And it's not at the end of the day, I have to put on a swimsuit. So the whole controversy that, came to light in Hawaii, which really in hindsight is not controversy at all, but it definitely sucked while it was happening. Yeah. I went to Hawaii, was hanging out with Miss Hawaii and actually ended up having a day off. So she flew over to the island that I was at and we hung out by the pool and had a good time. And, we're just walking around. And then the next thing I know, my swimsuit photo from Hawaii versus 6 weeks before that in Miss America, they were side by side in People Magazine and on Us Weekly and all these things. And to be honest, the public perception was like, I still looked great, right? It was like,
you did.
well, I did. Yeah.
You really did.
I'm like, I would give you all my teeth on this side just to look like that. Not really. But yeah, so it was just really bizarre because the public perception was fine. They were all like,
right.
"Oh, she looks great. Who cares? Whatever." It was the internal conversations that were happening within the Miss America organization that really got to me. It was suddenly that I was not going to be a good Miss America because I had, sort of bounced back a few pounds from where I was. And it was just all of these sort of projections and expectations from many people in the program. That's the stuff that got my wheels turning and really got in my head. So that was really bizarre because you start to realize, like, the very people who are supposed to understand this struggle, other contestants and candidates, other people who have watched girls go through this, they should be your biggest cheerleaders, and they're the ones that are happiest to tear you down. So that was a really bizarre revelation for me in that experience, that it's not the outside public perception, it's the internal that's really the issue.
Absolutely. No, I totally, I can relate. I mean, a little bit. I lost about 50 pounds to compete in teen, which I look back and I'm like, that wasn't healthy. I was working out at 4 a.m. before school and then after school and doing these crazy diets. And it's like you said, it's that short-term goal versus how do I maintain this? And there was a photo of me. I was like at some event and it was me next to our local mayor, and it was posted on our like local news station's website or Facebook. And there were literally like hundreds of comments from adults saying that I looked pregnant and like I had a beer gut and like, how could she win like this? And I'm like, I'm 17 years old and I'm doing something positive for my community. I'm literally like here with the mayor and you're focused on my weight. So you're right. It's so hateful. And I don't think people realize the stress of being a title holder, especially, as a teen, it was hard enough. I can't imagine being Miss America. And I mean, the stress that you're dealing with on the day to day, of course, you're not going to be the exact same size that you are when you win, whether it's you're losing weight from stress or gaining.
You know what? And the greater question in that is, who cares? What does it have to do with the job that I applied for, which was to travel the country, be a spokesperson for Children's Miracle Network hospitals, be a proponent of child sexual abuse education and prevention, be a positive role model for young women across the country, be a face of an organization. Like, none of that required me to show you my belly. Like, it just didn't. But you also, I think you bring up a much greater issue is that, the concept of bullying and harassment and all of these things that we've been talking about for 15 plus years now with kids, those things are things that are learned at home. And the internet is such an interesting peek into someone's household and how they were raised and how their parents operate and what is acceptable in their home. Because I've said this before, but so often, as you just mentioned, the comments that come from people are people who are old enough to know better.
Absolutely.
People who have children, people who absolutely would lose their minds if what they were writing about you was written about their kid. And
their kid, yeah.
Behind a keyboard, having the guts to say awful stuff about someone else's child who's doing something good for the world around them. So it's also about, as an individual, myself and you, it's like learning, which is very hard, learning how to put those people in perspective. And instead of taking on their projections of what's right and wrong in the world, understanding that they have bigger issues than you'll ever know how to deal with. And it's not that's not my problem.
Not my fix. Yeah. Yeah.
No problem.
Well, where do you think that strength comes from? Because you've never been one to shy away from talking about the hard stuff. You've never been one to shy away from vulnerability. Where does that confidence come from for you?
Well, it's not to say that I haven't spent many nights crying alone. So the things that people say do burrow under your skin, and the true strength is figuring out how to not let that show. And I think that there's a way to let it show. And I try really hard to have these conversations in a way that's like, hey, I still saw that. I still see you. And what you said was hurtful, but I'm going to choose to not come to your level. But I guess that strength comes from knowing that if somebody doesn't stand up for all of the people, then, it's only going to get worse. When I was really young, I got in a really big fight in like first grade, maybe.
Like a physical altercation?
Like a physical altercation on the playground. And it was a result of many weeks of this group of girls in my grade being mean. And I got in a fight finally. And my teacher said to my mom, obviously she's in trouble because she can't get in a fight at school. But my teacher said, but on a personal level, they had been, razzing her for a long time. And she finally just stood up for herself. And my mom, when we got home, I was so terrified. Like I knew I was getting for sure. Like I was like, I'm in so much trouble. My mom said, don't ever apologize for standing up for yourself. And I remember the where we were sitting and her face and all of it. She said, don't ever apologize for standing up for yourself. And I think that was the start of me being like, who are you talking to? It's not me. Like my mama said, I can stand up for myself. So I think a lot of that strength just comes from being raised in a household where using that strength was celebrated. I didn't get in trouble for, standing up for myself. And that doesn't mean I always did it the right way. I did get in trouble for doing it the wrong way. But I think it's important for parents to acknowledge when their kids are trying to make their place on the playground or make their place in the classroom or, and really valuing that their kids are trying to stand up for themselves. And instead of getting on to them, maybe it's having a conversation about a better way to do it, but celebrating that they stood up for themselves, because that's how we build, that character, I think. So I guess it comes from my parents, and maybe a little bit of it is innate.
Yeah. But you mentioned earlier that your platform when you were Miss America was bringing awareness to sexual abuse of children. Mm-hmm. And I know that you've said in other interviews that that's something that has touched your family. Mm-hmm. Do you think that has played a role in that strength coming from your mom and the female members of your family? Like, how do you think that has shaped you guys as family?
Absolutely. When I was really young, we had several conversations about, what people were allowed to touch and not touch on my body, and how to go about standing up for myself in that regard. And I think that's important because children who are vulnerable, children who are seen as weak or more meek are more likely to end up in situations of abuse. So I do think that definitely played a role in my mom letting me know that I had the power to say no, and that I was always allowed to tell someone if I felt uncomfortable. And there were times in my life when I did, and that was celebrated. And so again, it's just that reinforcement from parents and from guardians, from people who are older, teachers. Like when a kid's trying to tell you something, or when they're trying to stand up for themselves, often, we as a society as a whole are really good at telling kids to be quiet and to stop tattling and to stop telling on other people when they're really trying to tell you something that's important. So it's about, I think, as a society and as parents and guardians, really figuring out how to listen to kids in that scenario. But yeah, that definitely, I think, played a part in my ability to find the strength as I got older to continue doing that.
Well, speaking of standing up for yourself and for others, the controversy surrounding the emails that surfaced involving Sam Haskell and other MAO leadership speaking horribly about past Miss Americas, yourself included, mm-hmm. It made national headlines, and you were a huge part of the fight to remove that toxicity from MAO. Can you talk about your decision to stand up and fight back? Well, the emails barely scratched the surface of the culture that was permeating through the Miss America organization at that time. And the culture was one that was very, very exclusive. If you did not get on board and do as you were told, then you were ostracized. And that happened to many people, not just me, but it definitely happened to me. I mean, to go so far as to tell other Miss Americas that they weren't allowed to be in a photo with me, that I wasn't allowed to be featured in anything, that just on and on and on.
And so that made the decision to stand up pretty easy. You know, like I had this, all of this had been happening for 4 years at that point. And I had just come to terms with the fact that I was just not going to be a part of the organization anymore. And that was that. It was almost like I had to like go through, it felt like a divorce. Like this thing that I had loved, my mother loved, my grandmother loved, that I had worked 11 years to accomplish, finally actually got to the, you know, peak of it, enjoyed my year. I had a great year as Miss America. I mean, everybody has challenges, but ultimately I loved it. I would have done it for a whole nother year if somebody would have let me. You know, I really felt like it was important for me to stand up for the fact that I had felt such a loss from it. And I really wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to be involved in this thing that I had worked for. And so I felt like if he stayed, and if the people who allowed him to get away with that type of behavior stayed, then nothing would change. And that it was sort of like my one shot. It's like you get one shot to make these people go away and to hopefully build a culture that looks different. And I still think we're working on that second part, but the first part was successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I literally remember, and this is how clearly how big it was, you know, how big the shaming was, because I was the teen in 2015 and I don't remember what it was, but there was an event that we were both at. It was towards the end of my like summer tour. I think it was a state pageant or something. And I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, this is my hero. I want a photo with her. And we took a photo together and I posted it on our social media on the MAO teen page. And there was a conversation with MAO teen leadership about whether or not that picture was going to stay because of everything that was going on. And I will never forget that, being like, what? Like, this is a former Miss America. This is my hero.
Isn't it interesting to you though? Because what you witnessed was other adults who seemingly had no issue with me, right? I loved the teen program. I was a part of it, who had not witnessed necessarily any of the alleged behavior, had no real understanding for why I was being ostracized. Yeah. And instead of anyone actually questioning that and standing up for it, those people, whoever they are, and several state leaders across the country, local organizers across the country, everyone just listened. So everyone just said, okay, I still want to be a part of this club. So if it means being mean to this person or ostracizing this person or not acknowledging this person's existence, then I'll do it. And that to me was the larger issue, that you've got a nation full of adults involved in a women's empowerment organization that didn't see an issue in that moment. And like I said, it wasn't just me. This happened with other people. Mm-hmm. They just fell in line. They would just say, okay. And they did whatever they needed to do to stay in the club. And that was the larger issue to me, was that these were people who were shaping the hearts and minds of young women in our program. If that's the type of behavior that they were capable of, then what are they teaching the people around them? What example are they setting? And to me, that was the larger issue than Sam, was that he had created this culture where people just did whatever he said without thinking. And we all know that doesn't end well in history.
I love what you said about, you know, what are you teaching these young women? It's like you're teaching them to duck and put their heads down. And, you know, even if
like, why can't I post this photo? What did she do? What did she do so bad?
I remember like, because you were my hero. I remember meeting you for the first time in Atlantic City, and it was like my first Miss America's Outstanding Teen appearance. And I was so overcome because you were the first Miss America I'd ever watched fully on TV win. And, you know, you were someone who had also struggled with body issues, and like, you were you were just this staple of empowerment to me. And so to have any kind of concern about whether or not you were a good role model. And that's the thing, is I don't think it had anything to do with you. It was a part of that, like, oh, keep your head down. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I posted the photo anyway. It's there, but
that's my kind of
people. Just to think about, you're right, the way that he affected the organization. And thank God that you and others stood up and said, this is not what we're teaching young women.
Right. Yeah.
Thank God. So on that note, I mean, what advice would you give to those who are struggling with acceptance of themselves, whether it's because of abuse or a general lack of confidence? What would you say to the women who are really in the trenches fighting to love themselves?
Ooh. How long do we have? No, I'm just kidding. That's really hard. I think it depends on where the root of your issue stems from. So the thing I would say is that your mental health and mental clarity is incredibly important, more important than any title, than any school you can go to, than anything you can accomplish. And so what I would say is to find yourself a really good therapist and stick with it. I don't think we talk enough about the fact that we need help sorting our emotions, building emotional intelligence, understanding why we think the things we do about ourselves, but also why we do the things that we do. Why do we self-sabotage? Why do I look in the mirror and think this versus this? Why don't I think I'm smart enough to accomplish this? And no amount of accomplishments is going to change the way you feel about yourself unless you do the work. So to me, I would say my greatest piece of advice for anybody struggling with any self-acceptance or any hurdle that you're facing is if you're hurting, you go to the doctor. If you're mentally and emotionally hurting, you go to a therapist and seek help. There's literally nothing wrong with it. And many, many, many people go to therapy and seek counseling for maintenance, not because there's anything outwardly or inwardly that is, a huge thing. And I think it's really important. I started going to therapy when I was 15, and I've gone on and off ever since then. So for 16 years, I feel like I've done my best to do the work, and none of us are perfect, but at least you're trying, right? So that would be my greatest advice is to seek out help.
I'm a big therapy person. It's good.
Yeah, so good for you.
It's so good for you.
Don't do dumb things that, are harmful to your life.
It's so good. So you made the decision, moving forward a bit, you made the decision to run for Congress at a time when I think, there's only 4 women under 40 in Congress. Is that right? So number one, that's huge. And you actually won the Democratic nomination for Alabama's 3rd district.
I did.
Can you talk about that journey and that experience?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that that started because of the Miss America organization, upheaval in the national media, and a group of people that live here in my hometown and in the district approached me and said, hey, like, if you can handle this and you can stand up like that, then we would love to see you run for office. And at first I was like, you guys are nuts, and thank you, but no thank you. But then I started thinking about it and looking at, just the demographics of leadership across the country, and there just aren't enough women. And luckily, 2018 changed that in a lot of ways, but we're still not there. And, if anything prepares you to run for office, being Miss America is it. So, all of the stuff that candidates have to learn how to do, I already had. I had branding, but I also knew how to speak in public and to stump versus media, like all of the things that really take a long time to shape for people who aren't used to those arenas, if you will. So the hardest part for me was figuring out like how to structure a team and what does that look like, and getting into the nitty gritty of policy versus just understanding it and being able to intelligently and eloquently and diplomatically express an opinion in a state where my politics were in the minority. So it was an extraordinary experience that taught me a tremendous amount about my intelligence, first and foremost. I think that's something that I used to question, mostly because my educational path looks different than most people's. But it taught me that I am a lot smarter than I ever thought I was. And my capabilities are endless. Raising nearly $500,000 over the course of 7 months is a tremendous feat, and putting together a viable campaign that raised national attention, got national dollars, was on international media. I mean, that's huge for someone at 29 with little to no political experience. So I'm very proud of it. And it's something that I hope inspires other young women to look at themselves and see that they they, just as much as anybody, belong in the political arena.
Absolutely. And I think it's huge because representation is everything. It's so important for young women to be able to look up and see women in positions of power and to see women doing their thing. It's so important. And so I hope that, like you said, it does encourage and inspire other people to follow suit. So you did this whole campaign, like you said, it garnered international attention, but you didn't win. How did not winning shape your journey, and what did you learn from not winning?
Well, I think it's important to note that, like, realistically, I knew I wasn't going to win.
Right.
Numbers just weren't there. Of course, you can't say that while you're running. If you want people to believe in you, you have to tell them that it's possible. But the numbers just weren't there. But it has shaped me tremendously in that. Just going back to what I said, I figured out how to put together a machine. I figured out all of the elements of running a political campaign. When most people start at like city council or, a state house seat, I was running for a federal seat, which is a whole different ballgame. And so it just really shaped the fact that that I knew that I was capable of achieving whatever it is that I wanted to do. What it did do was throw me yet again into, well, am I doing enough? And so then it became, well, what's my next career path step that makes me feel like I'm contributing the way I want to be? Before, I was working as a news anchor and I loved my job. I thought it was really fun, but running for office, it's just this high of like, there's so much to do in this world and I could be the one to participate and make things happen. That when you come out of running for office, the thought of going back to doing something that doesn't make you feel like you're contributing the way that you want to, you just don't want to do that. So if anything, just like many things I've done, I didn't expect to win Miss America. That derailed my plans. And I didn't expect to end up back in Alabama. That derailed my plans. Like all of these sort of twists and turns that my life has taken are weird, but they all have meaning ultimately, and they all lead to something else. So this season post running for office has been a lot of me figuring out what do I want to do and what will make me feel like I'm contributing. And I keep coming back to politics and just worked on a presidential campaign. And so ultimately, I think I will end up being elected to something at some point. We'll just figure out what that looks like and from where.
Well, I'm ready to vote for you for president. So
thank you. I think at this rate, I'll need to be 78 in order to run. So.
You haven't played 78.
I have 47 more years to figure it out.
So much time.
Maybe by then.
Well, you've also said that you're very passionate about race relations, as am I, and changing the us versus them mentality. So number one, as a woman of color, thank you for being an ally. And what are some ways that you believe that the system are failing marginalized groups, and how can we do better? That's a loaded question, but if there's one or two things that really jump out.
I think that it's all of it is intertwined, right? People of color are systematically oppressed in a multitude of ways, right? So rural areas often are inhabited by people who are lower income. Lower income people, by and large, are people who are minorities. Well, they get less educational benefits. Their schools are traditionally failing. There's not a lot of opportunity work-wise. Well, when you're in a part of a state or in an area or in a county where there's no opportunity, there is a higher crime rate. And that leads to incarceration, as we know. And then incarceration leads to being incarcerated again. And so it's like this system that keeps happening over and over and over again. And much of it is because we're unwilling to acknowledge that so much of this country was built on the backs of people who are Black. And were not compensated in any way for the work that they put in to building this country to be what it is. And so we have a lot of work to do to bridge that other divide. But I think that it starts with white people having conversations with other white people about our role in the way our society currently works, and how we got here. And I think what ends up happening, and I've had this conversation happens a lot in the South, as I'm sure you can imagine. There's this idea that it's like, well, it wasn't me, and it wasn't you. So like, why do we care? Just get over it. And it's, first of all, trauma travels from generation to generation in your DNA, right? So there are people who are living now who are very much carrying the trauma of their ancestors. And then it may not have been my family or my parents' family. And in fact, I know from being able to look in history and through our genealogy that it wasn't. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to having these conversations to make things look different now. So without going into an entire monologue about the things that we could be doing, I think the greatest thing that we can do is to open our hearts and minds to the conversations of people, to listen to each other. And, as our race has been the oppressor, we have a responsibility to have these conversations and to not put the onus on people of color to explain it to us, but rather to have these conversations and to do the work as a people so that we can come together and figure out how to best progress as a country. Because if we don't, then I fear we're on a really, really, really poor trajectory without that.
I couldn't.
I don't know if that was eloquent. There's a lot of things going on in my brain.
No.
It's also been a really long time since I've actually had a deep dive into this topic. So I'm like, there's a lot more I could probably say, but
no, that was,
let's not let this interview be 700 years long.
that was wonderful. That was amazing. And during your campaign also, you really worked to engage young people by going out to the colleges and the universities and encouraging students to get to the polls and vote. What would you say to a young person right now that's watching this that might be on the fence about whether or not they want to exercise their right to vote in the upcoming elections?
Well, I would say first and foremost, I understand why in a presidential election, you may feel as though your vote doesn't matter. And it does, but every other election is so important. And your local elections are where things really impact you daily. So voting for your city councilman, understanding who your House representative is or your assembly person, those things are so important. And across the country, you can Google this. They have come down to 5 votes, 6 votes, someone winning an election just on that very small number. So your vote really does matter. And it's also really important to vote where you live. Often young people, I think, their parents will say you should vote here in this state or that state, but I really encourage you to take a moment, go through these things, figure out why you believe the things that you believe. Your parents may be lovely human beings and well-meaning, but you may find that you feel differently than they do. And when you vote where you live, you impact your way of life daily where you are. So if that means being on your college campus and figuring out where your polling place is and registering to vote. In so many states, you do not have to be a resident of that state. For instance, I can speak from Alabama. If you go to college and you have an address and you have a valid driver's license, it doesn't have to be from our state. You can register to vote where you live and you can vote there. So just really dig into those details and know that your voice matters and your vote matters. And it, especially this day and age, matters more than it ever could. So please don't let the people who fought for your right to vote, don't let that fight be for naught.
Oof, preach.
Yeah. That's the thing that really bothers me is I'm like, people literally fought and died for women to vote, for Black people to vote, so to not is such a, it's so disappointing, but it's also, words are failing me. Go vote.
So we have 47 years to wait for you to become president. So in the meantime, in that time, what are you doing now? And what's next for you in the next couple of years?
So post running for office, I started a small business. So I've been doing brand and marketing consulting. And so I have a couple of clients that I work with in their digital marketing efforts. And I am currently looking at some opportunities here in the state to potentially buy property and start some businesses. So lots of wheels turning at the moment. But for now, since I am also currently quarantined, not to date this interview at all.
Oh yeah.
Quarantined. So
there's a world pandemic going on.
Yeah, there's a world pandemic, and so luckily, because I do consulting and I have clients, I feel very fortunate to still have income coming in and to be okay during this time frame. So we'll see what the world looks like when this is all over. But my hope, we'll see what the world looks like. But yeah, I'm living. I'm happy. That's really all that matters.
That's so good. And you're so inspiring and
so are you.
Well, thank you. But I'm very inspired by you and I just thank you for being so open and being so vulnerable. And I'm a big like Brene Brown person, and I'm obsessed with her. And she's always talking about vulnerability and how that is our greatest strength. And it really is. And it's something that you do so beautifully. And the world needs more of that. So thank you for talking to me and sharing your story and giving your time tonight.
I am so happy to. Thank you for doing this. And I look forward to seeing all of the great things that you accomplish, both with your title in the Miss America organization and beyond. Super proud to know you.
Thank you so much.